In 1887, a constable from Scotland Yard stood in the evidence room at New Street Station, staring at something that shouldn't have been possible. Before him lay a Brahma safety lock, the most sophisticated security device in the British Empire, opened cleanly, without a scratch on its surface. The tool used to defeat it sat beside the lock, a bent hairpin and a piece of wire salvaged from a meat tin. But what disturbed the constable most wasn't the crime itself. It was the size of the fingerprints left on the metal. They belonged to a child. Who was this boy? And how did a street urchin from the worst slums of Whitechapel become so skilled that London's criminal underworld whispered his name with the same reverence they once reserved for master safecrackers twice his age? We're about to uncover his story. Our first glimpse comes not from official records, but from the private journals of Eleanor Wickham, a charity worker who operated a ragged school near Dorset Street in Spitalfields. Her entry from March of 1883 describes a peculiar incident. A boy, no more than 8 years old, had been found inside the school's supply cupboard at dawn. The lock showed no signs of forcing. When questioned, the child claimed he'd been locked inside by accident the previous evening. But Eleanor noted something strange in her journal. The boy's hands were covered in graphite dust, and several pieces of wire protruded from his torn jacket pocket. She describes him as painfully thin, with dark eyes that seemed far older than his years, and a watchfulness that made her deeply uneasy. She doesn't record his name in that entry. Perhaps he never gave one. But that same journal gives us a crucial detail 6 months later. Eleanor writes of a break-in at the school during which nothing was stolen except food and a single book from her personal collection, a technical manual on clockwork mechanisms that had belonged to her late father, a watchmaker. The lock on her office door had been opened so carefully that she initially thought she'd simply forgotten to secure it. Only when she found the book missing did she realize what had happened. She adds an almost parenthetical observation that still carries weight more than a century later. I cannot shake the feeling that the boy from the cupboard has been here. There is an intelligence in this theft that suggests not mere hunger, but curiosity. To understand how a child could develop such skills, we must first understand where he came from. The Spitalfields of the 1880s was a landscape of almost unimaginable poverty. The streets around Dorset Street, which would later become infamous as the site of Mary Kelly's murder during the Ripper investigations, were a warren of doss houses, opium dens, and brothels. Children here didn't attend school. They worked, they stole, or they starved. But among this population of desperate souls, there existed a particular subset of criminal specialists, the lockpickers. These weren't common burglars who smashed windows or forced doors. They were artisans of a sort, men who understood the mechanical poetry of pins and tumblers, who could feel through metal the precise moment when a cylinder would yield. The best of them could earn more in a single night than a factory worker made in a month. Our boy, as he begins to appear in the historical record, seems to have attached himself to this world not by choice, but by necessity. The next concrete evidence appears in the Old Bailey proceedings from November of 1884. A man named Thomas Bellows, aged 41, stands trial for the burglary of a jeweler's shop on Cheapside. The case itself is unremarkable. Bellows was a known offender with multiple prior convictions. But buried in the testimony is a detail that catches our attention. The investigating officer, Inspector Davies, notes under cross-examination that the rear door of the premises had been opened with considerable skill, suggesting the work of an experienced screwsman. But then he adds something peculiar. Several witnesses reported seeing Bellows in the company of a small boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years of age, on the night in question. This boy was observed standing watch at the corner of the street while Bellows entered the premises. When the defense barrister suggests the child might have been Bellow's own son, the inspector's response is telling. The accused has no children, sir. And I would note that this particular boy has been mentioned in connection with at least 3 other cases in recent months, always in the company of different men, always performing the same function. The boy is never called to testify. He vanishes from the court record as mysteriously as he appeared in it. But Inspector Davies' observation opens a window into a practice that was common in London's criminal underworld. Young boys, particularly those with small hands and quick minds, were often recruited by professional thieves. They could slip through windows, climb drain pipes, and, most valuably, they could be trained to manipulate locks that adult fingers found too delicate. They were called twirls in the vernacular of the time. Child apprentices in the art of illegal entry. What made our particular boy different, however, wasn't that he was being used by criminals. Hundreds of children were. What made him different was what happened next. In February of 1885, the Police Gazette publishes a notice that at first seems routine. It requests information regarding a series of burglaries in the Bethnal Green and Shoreditch districts, characterized by entry gained through locked doors with no visible damage to the mechanisms. Photographic President estimates that at least 15 separate premises have been violated over the previous 4 months. The stolen goods vary wildly. Food, clothing, small amounts of money, books, and oddly, several sets of tools including files, pin vises, and precision instruments. What's unusual is the final line of the notice. The investigating officers believe these crimes may be the work of a juvenile offender operating without adult supervision. This was almost unheard of. Child criminals existed in great numbers, but they worked under the control of adult criminals. Fagin's gang from Oliver Twist wasn't fiction. It was documentary. Children didn't operate independently because they lacked the knowledge, the connections to dispose of stolen goods, and the protection that came from being part of an established crew. Yet here was someone breaking that pattern. A boy who had somehow learned enough to work alone. The spring and summer of 1885 bring a flurry of reports that begin to sketch a clearer picture. In April, a pawnbroker in Whitechapel reports being visited by a youth of perhaps 11 years who attempted to sell a set of locksmith's tools. The pawnbroker, suspicious of the item's quality and the boy's age, refused the transaction and later reported it to police. He describes the child as uncommonly well-spoken for his station, and notes that the tools appeared to be hand-modified, filed down, and adjusted in ways that suggested practical use rather than simple theft. In June, a night watchman at a warehouse near the docks reports chasing away an intruder. He never got close enough to apprehend the figure, but he was certain it was a child based on the size and speed. What troubled him most was discovering that the lock on the warehouse's side entrance had been opened. He'd heard no drilling, no hammering, no sounds of forcing at all. The door had simply been opened as though with a key. Then in August comes the incident that would change everything. The Worshipful Company of Clockmakers maintained a hall on Cheapside, a building that housed not only their meeting rooms, but also a small museum of historical timepieces and mechanical curiosities. It was protected by 3 separate locks on the main entrance, each made by a different prestigious manufacturer: a Chubb detector lock, a Brahma precision lock, and a custom-made mechanism created by the company's own master craftsman. On the morning of August the 17th, the hall's caretaker arrived to find the door standing open. Nothing was stolen. Not the valuable clocks, not the silver ceremonial pieces, not even the small amount of money kept in the office strongbox. But someone had been inside. Candle wax was found on several tables. Books had been removed from shelves and left open. Most tellingly, Several of the display clocks had been partially disassembled, their back plates removed, and their mechanisms exposed. The 3 locks on the door showed no damage whatsoever. The clockmakers' company was not an organization accustomed to being trifled with. They immediately contacted Scotland Yard and demanded a thorough investigation. The case was assigned to Detective Inspector Edmund Reed, a man who had spent 15 years investigating burglaries across London and who would later write a memoir detailing his experiences. Reed's investigation uncovered something that fascinated and disturbed him in equal measure. Through interviews with nearby shopkeepers and residents, he pieced together that a small figure had been seen near the hall multiple times over the previous week, always at dusk, always alone. The figure appeared to be studying the building. One merchant recalled the boy, for everyone agreed it was a boy, standing completely still across the street for nearly an hour, simply watching the entrance. But it was Reed's examination of the locks themselves that led to his most significant conclusion. Reed brought in a locksmith named Arthur Granville, considered one of the finest technical minds in London, to examine the mechanisms. Granville's report, preserved in the Metropolitan Police Archives, makes for extraordinary reading. He confirms that all 3 locks were opened without force, without picks that left telltale scratches, without any of the usual signs of criminal entry. But more than that, he notes something that Reed himself had missed. The locks had been opened in sequence, from easiest to most difficult, as though someone were practicing, testing themselves against increasingly complex challenges. The Chubb lock, though sophisticated, had a known vulnerability that only experienced locksmiths understood. It had been exploited perfectly. The Brahma lock, which had famously gone undefeated in a public challenge for over 60 years, until finally picked in 1851, showed evidence of an approach that Granville describes as intuitive rather than methodical. And the custom mechanism, which even Granville himself struggled to analyze, had been defeated through what he could only call an act of mechanical empathy. His final assessment contains a line that Reed underscores in his notes. Whoever opened these locks understood them not merely as obstacles to overcome, but as puzzles to solve. This was not burglary. This was education. Reed became convinced he was hunting a prodigy. Over the following months, he began collecting reports from across London, cross-referencing unsolved burglaries and unusual break-ins, searching for patterns. What emerged was startling. There appeared to be 2 distinct categories of crimes involving sophisticated lock manipulation. The first category consisted of professional jobs: jewelers, banks, wealthy homes. These showed the hallmarks of organized criminal operations, multiple perpetrators, careful planning, goods quickly fenced through established networks. But the second category defied easy explanation. These were smaller incidents, often unreported to police because nothing of significant value was taken. A doctor's office entered, and medical books borrowed then returned. A shipping company's warehouse opened, and only ship's biscuits stolen. A music shop, where someone had picked the lock to the repair room and apparently spent time examining the interior mechanisms of broken instruments. Reed began to suspect these weren't crimes in any conventional sense. They were the actions of someone using the city itself as a workshop and a library. But who was teaching this child? That question gnawed at Reed constantly. A skill this refined didn't appear spontaneously. Someone, somewhere, had trained this boy. Yet every inquiry into London's known lockpickers, every informant in the criminal underworld, returned the same answer. They knew nothing about a child operator. The solution to that mystery arrives from an unexpected source. In October of 1885, Reed receives a letter. It's written in a careful, educated hand, and it comes from a woman named Margaret Hadley, widow of a man named Samuel Hadley. The name means nothing to Reed initially, but as he reads, a picture begins to form. Samuel Hadley had been a locksmith of considerable reputation, operating a small shop in Clerkenwell for 30 years. He had died 2 years previously, in 1883, from consumption. Margaret writes that she's been following the newspaper reports of the mysterious break-ins with growing certainty that she knows something relevant to the investigation. In the final year of his life, she explains, Samuel had taken in a boy from the streets. Not formally, not through any legal arrangement, but simply because the child had begun sleeping in the shop's doorway, and Samuel, a kind man despite his gruff manner, couldn't bring himself to chase the boy away. The child was perhaps 7 years old, though he claimed not to know his age. He said his name was Thomas, though Margaret suspected this was a lie. He could read, which was unusual for a street child, but he spoke with the thick accent of the worst rookeries. Samuel, who had no children of his own, began allowing the boy to sleep in the shop's back room. In exchange, Thomas, if that was truly his name, swept floors and ran errands. But Samuel quickly noticed something remarkable. The boy was obsessed with the locks. He would stand for hours watching Samuel work, absorbing every movement, every technique. When Samuel explained the theory behind different mechanisms, the boy understood immediately, making intuitive leaps that had taken Samuel years of apprenticeship to grasp. Against his better judgment, Samuel began to teach him properly. Margaret's letter describes this with a mixture of pride and concern. Her husband, she writes, recognized that he'd encountered a mind of unusual capability. The boy didn't simply memorize techniques. He understood the fundamental principles. Within months, he could disassemble and reassemble complex locks blindfolded. He could pick mechanisms that Samuel himself found challenging. Most remarkably, he could feel through his fingertips the precise moment when a lock would yield, a sensitivity that even master craftsmen struggled to develop. But Samuel worried about what he'd created. He recognized that he was training someone who lived in desperate poverty, someone with no prospects and no protection, someone who might use these skills to survive in ways that Samuel couldn't condone, but also couldn't entirely condemn. When Samuel died in the spring of 1883, the boy vanished. Margaret had tried to find him, but he disappeared completely into the vast anonymous mass of London's street children. She'd assumed he'd either died, which was tragically common, or had been absorbed into a workhouse or criminal gang. But now, reading about these unusual break-ins, she felt certain she knew who was responsible. She provides Reed with a physical description. Small for his age, dark hair, unusually pale skin, a scar across his left eyebrow from some childhood injury. Most distinctively, Samuel had noted that the boy's hands, despite their small size, had developed calluses in unusual places, patterns that came from constant manipulation of metal tools. Reed is galvanized. For the first time, he has a concrete lead, a name, even if it's probably false, and a history. He begins searching workhouse records, police reports, any documentation that might contain a boy matching this description. The search proves frustrating. There are thousands of children named Thomas in London's poor houses and charity schools. None match the description precisely, or rather, dozens match it loosely but lead nowhere. The boy, if he's still alive, has clearly learned to avoid any interaction with authority that might create a record. But Reed's investigation has an unexpected effect. News of his inquiries spreads through the criminal underworld. And in November of 1885, he receives a visitor at Scotland Yard who provides information that shifts the entire investigation onto a darker path. The visitor is a man named James Craddock, a known receiver of stolen goods who nevertheless has maintained an uneasy relationship with police by occasionally providing information about his competitors. Craddock is worried, and that worry has brought him to Reed's office. He tells Reed that there's been talk in certain establishments, the public houses and flash houses where criminals gather, about a boy with extraordinary skills. At first, Craddock explains, the talk was dismissive, almost amused. A child lockpicker was a novelty, perhaps useful for small jobs, nothing to concern serious professionals. But recently, the tone has changed. Several major criminal figures have become interested in acquiring the boy's services. These aren't common thieves. These are men who organize large-scale operations, who plan bank robberies and jewel heists, who have connections to criminal networks that stretch across Europe. They see in this child something valuable, a tool that could be used for sophisticated crimes that require both size and skill. Craddock's concern is professional rather than humanitarian. He worries that if the boy is recruited by one of these organizations, the resulting increase in successful high-value burglaries will bring down unprecedented police attention on the entire criminal ecosystem, which would be bad for business. But he also provides Reed with something more valuable than intelligence. He provides a warning. There's one man in particular who's been asking about the boy. His name is Vincent Marlowe, and he's one of the most dangerous criminals operating in London. Marlowe doesn't simply steal, he controls. He runs protection rackets, illegal gambling dens, and most profitably, he organizes what the newspapers delicately call criminal enterprises of the first class. When a major burglary occurs in London, when a bank vault is opened or a country house stripped of its valuables, the odds are good that Marlowe had a hand in planning it. Marlowe has been searching for the boy for weeks. He's offering money for information, substantial money, and he's made it clear that he intends to recruit the child whether the boy wishes it or not. Reed understands immediately that the situation has become urgent. A child with this level of skill, falling under the control of someone like Marlowe, would become an instrument for crimes that could dwarf anything London has seen. More than that, Reed finds himself feeling an unexpected sense of responsibility. This boy, whoever he is still just a child. A child who learned his skills not for criminal purposes, but from intellectual curiosity, who broke into the clockmaker's hall not to steal, but to learn. He deserves better than to become Vincent Marlowe's property. Reed makes a decision. He'll find the boy first, and when he does, he'll offer him an alternative. But finding someone who's spent his entire life avoiding discovery proves almost impossible. Reed deploys constables to watch the locations where previous break-ins occurred. He has informants spread word through the street children's networks. He even returns to Eleanor Wickham's ragged school, showing her Margaret Hadley's description, asking if she recognizes the boy from her journal entry 2 years prior. She does. Without question, she tells Reed, that's the same child. She remembers the eyes most clearly, the unsettling intelligence in them. But she hasn't seen him since that morning in the cupboard. She assumed he'd moved on, as street children constantly did, or died, as they too often did. Weeks pass with no progress. December arrives, bringing with it the bitter cold that makes London streets even more lethal for those sleeping rough. Reed begins to fear that his search will end not with finding the boy, but with discovering his body frozen in some alley. Then, on the morning of December 23rd, 1885, something extraordinary happens. Reed arrives at his office at Scotland Yard to find that someone has broken in during the night. The lock on Reed's office door, a police-issue mechanism considered highly secure, had been opened without damage. Nothing was stolen, but on Reed's desk sat a folded piece of paper, and beside it, arranged in a precise row, lay 5 different locks, each one opened and disassembled, their internal components laid out like anatomical diagrams. The note was written in careful, slightly awkward handwriting, the hand of someone educated but unpracticed. Inspector Reed, I know you are looking for me. I know what Mr. Marlowe wants. I am not a criminal, sir. I only wished to learn. The locks are a gift to show you what I can do. I have a proposal. Reed sat frozen, reading the note 3 times. The audacity was breathtaking. A child had broken into Scotland Yard itself, into a detective's private office, not to escape justice, but to negotiate. The note continued. I will help you catch Mr. Marlowe. I know things about his operations that your informants do not. I have been inside places where he keeps records. In exchange, I ask only that you help me find legitimate work. I do not wish to be a thief. I wish to be a locksmith like Mr. Hadley was. Please leave your answer in the personal column of tomorrow's Times under the name Samuel. I will find it. Reed immediately convened a meeting with his superiors. The situation was unprecedented. A juvenile informant was risky enough, but one who just demonstrated he could penetrate police headquarters? Some argued for treating this as a serious security breach and hunting the boy down. Others saw the opportunity that Reed did. Marlowe had evaded prosecution for years. Perhaps this strange child could provide the leverage they needed. Reed placed his advertisement. Samuel, agreed. Name the time and place. A friend of your teacher. 3 days later, Reed received instructions to come alone to a specific warehouse near Limehouse at midnight. He went, against protocol, armed but apprehensive. Inside the darkened building, a small figure stepped from the shadows. Even expecting a child, Reed was startled by how young he looked. Perhaps 12 years old, thin to the point of starvation, but with those distinctive eyes that Eleanor Wickham had described, ancient and calculating. The boy, who refused to give any name but Thomas, laid out what he knew. He'd been surviving by breaking into warehouses for food and shelter. In doing so, he'd discovered that one building was being used by Marlowe's organization to store stolen goods before they were moved abroad. More valuably, he'd found a ledger, hidden in a false-backed drawer, that detailed transactions going back 2 years. Over the following week, Thomas led Reed to evidence that would result in the largest criminal prosecution London had seen in a decade. The boy's knowledge of locks meant he could access places that would have required warrants and forced entries, making certain evidence inadmissible. But he could tell Reed exactly where to look, what to search for, and how to build an unassailable case. In February of 1886, Vincent Marlowe and 14 associates stood trial at the Old Bailey. The prosecution's case was devastating. Marlowe was sentenced to 20 years penal servitude. And Thomas? Reed kept his promise. Through his connections, he arranged for the boy to become an apprentice to Arthur Granville, the locksmith who had examined the clockmaker's hall locks. Granville, intrigued by Reed's description of the boy's abilities, agreed immediately. The final record we have comes from Granville's own diary, dated March 1886. The boy arrived today. He is indeed as skilled as Reed claimed, perhaps more so. But what strikes me most is his hunger, not for food, though he clearly needs that too, but for knowledge. He wishes to understand not just how locks work, but why they work. I believe I have taken on not merely an apprentice, but perhaps the finest mechanical mind I have encountered. I asked him today what he hoped to become. He said simply, I wish to make locks that cannot be picked, sir, so that no one else needs to learn what I learned. Thomas, if that was ever truly his name, disappears from the criminal records at this point. But in 1893, a patent was filed for a revolutionary lock mechanism by a young locksmith named Thomas Granville, bearing Arthur's surname. The design was brilliant, incorporating principles that wouldn't become standard for another 20 years. The boy who'd once broken into the clockmaker's hall to study their mechanisms had become a creator rather than a defeater of locks. The child who'd lived by opening what was closed had found his calling in protecting what needed protection. Scotland Yard's evidence room still contains those 5 locks he left on Reed's desk, mounted in a display case. A small brass plate beneath them reads, "Evidence of what desperation and genius can create when given the chance to become something else." Willingness with a boy sleeping in doorways, teaching himself to survive through an extraordinary gift. We watched as that gift nearly destroyed him, as it attracted the attention of men who saw him only as a tool. And we saw how one moment of desperate courage, breaking into Scotland Yard itself to propose an alternative future, changed everything. The streets of Victorian London consumed thousands of children, but this one, through intelligence, audacity, and the intervention of a few decent people, found his way out. Not through charity or luck, but by offering the very skills that might have damned him as the price of his redemption. His real name, his true origins, the details of those early years remain lost to history. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some mysteries deserve to remain locked.